stay-at-home orders. Most of us are based in New York City, the global epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic. And here in New York, New Yorkers are pulling together. Every evening at 7 p.m., New Yorkers are cheering for the medical professionals who are risking their lives on the front lines of this crisis. So there's a man standing on the podium right now fixing a light, which suggests that it may be another few moments before the president gets out here. So we'd like to try to take as many of your questions as we can. If you could just type your questions in the comments, and our producers from our remote newsroom will gather them and pull answers for you. And alerting them that you're going to be typing in questions any minute. So we have been seeing an increasingly hostile President Trump in the last few briefings. On Sunday, he stormed out of the briefing after an Associated Press reporter questioned him about delays in the administration's response. And yesterday, he even attacked a Fox News reporter, complaining about the questions that she was asking about shortages of medical supplies in hospitals. So just to review some of the stuff that's happening in the news that the president may be responding to, the New York Times uncovered new memos from President Trump's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, warning on January 29th about the dangers of the coronavirus. Again, President Trump has been repeatedly claiming that no one knew that this was coming. We put out a great video by our news and politics director, Nico Pitney, today that really lays out the timeline well of just how much the president knew in advance of this happening. But this new Peter Navarro story, we know now, we've seen a memo that on January 29th, he warned the National Security Council that, quote, the lack of immune protection or an existing cure or vaccine would leave Americans defenseless in the case of a full-blown coronavirus outbreak on U.S. soil. This lack of protection elevates the risk of the coronavirus evolving into a full-blown pandemic, imperiling the lives of millions of Americans. And even after that, the White House did not immediately react, and nearly a month later, Navarro sent another memo warning the increasing probability of a full-blown COVID-19 pandemic that could infect as many as 100 million Americans with a loss of life of as many as 1.2 million souls. The very next day, President Trump tweeted out, the coronavirus is very much under control in the USA. Stock market starting to look very good to me. So that's some of the news that we got today. We also have seen Trump lashing out at his own team. There were several key departures today. He got rid of his third press secretary, and he is replacing that press secretary with a frequent Fox News personality and a member of his original campaign team. That is Kayleigh McEnany, and she is a very outspoken tweeter who has attacked President Obama in racist language, has attacked Democrats, has promoted conspiracy theories, and now she is the fourth White House press secretary in under 4 years. Also departing today, the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, and President Trump has fired the Defense Department watchdog who was to oversee coronavirus relief funds. So that there seem to be quite a bit of shakeups going on within the administration. Our team is your questions from the comments, and we will try to answer them. And I see, got one now. All right, Ian McKenna from our newsroom is grabbing a question, and I will answer it in just a moment. It's from Deanna. And as soon as that gets typed in, I will answer that question. We're expecting the president in a few minutes. We know that he has been meeting with some of his economic advisors, and he is expected to ask for more money for the small business protections. While we've got those questions about to come up, I'm just going to do something I've done in recent days, which is just sort of walk through the timeline that we've been looking at, because we know that President Trump is today going to say that no one could have seen this coming. And I just want to remind you how many people saw this coming. The Obama administration in 2014 specifically put together a global health security unit within the National Security Council because they specifically saw the threat of a global pandemic as being one of the big threats facing the nation. In fact, tomorrow we're likely to share a video from 2014 of President Obama specifically talking about the threat of a global pandemic. We know that President Obama's team also put together a 69-page pandemic response handbook. We know that during the transition, Obama's National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, says that she specifically handed off this playbook to Trump's team, to his national security advisors, that she specifically underscored that in her estimation, the threat of a global pandemic was one of the biggest threats that could be facing the nation. And reporting from Ken Klippenstein of The Nation says that the Pentagon was flagged in 2017 about a potential shortage of masks, hospital beds, ventilators, and other equipment. And that the administration warned that one of the most likely, the Pentagon rather, warned that one of the most likely and significant threats facing this country was a novel respiratory disease. So those were the warnings that President Trump had at the very beginning of his term. And if time allows, I will go into some of the other warnings that came his way. But first, I'm going to answer Deanna's question. Deanna asks whether the current guidance is to wear masks when outside of the home and to disinfect everything from the stores. The answer is that the CDC updated its guidance on masks last week to recommend wearing cloth face coverings in public settings where other social distancing measures are difficult to maintain. For instance, going to the grocery store or to the pharmacy. And to especially do this in areas of significant community-based transmissions, places like here in New York City, where we have more cases than anywhere else in the country. President Trump went out of his way, the very same day that he released these new guidelines, he went out of his way to say that he himself will not be wearing a mask. He suggested that it would be awkward to wear a mask while he is meeting with presidents, dictators, and kings and queens. We have another question coming in now, and we'll grab you the answer to that. Here we go. We have a question from Dominguez. Dominguez asks, how did they allow voters to come out and vote in Wisconsin? And Dominguez, that is a great question. It is horrifying that there are long lines of voters in Wisconsin voting in both local elections and in the Democratic primary. The Democratic governor tried to postpone the vote until June, but was blocked by Republican lawmakers and a conservative-led state court. And we have seen that lines for in-person voting have stretched for blocks, and that on top of insisting on holding the vote today. On top of that, a number of polling places have been closed, resulting in longer lines and larger crowds at the polling places that remain open. In Milwaukee, polling locations were cut from 180 to 5. From Green Bay, they went from 31 to 2. And meanwhile, the conservative majority U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Wisconsin could not extend its deadline for mail-in ballots. Voting rights activists say that this ruling effectively throws out thousands of ballots. So yes, it is shocking and startling that Wisconsin is voting today. At least 15 states have delayed their primaries because of the current health crisis. At the urging of Joe Biden, the Democratic National Convention has been pushed until August, and Biden is now pushing to make it a virtual convention altogether and not bring together hundreds of people in one space. So that is certainly very alarming that the voting that has been taking place in Wisconsin. No one should have to choose between their right to vote and their right to their own health. It's really unconscionable. So we're going to pull some more of your questions. As our team gathers those questions, I'm going to just go a little bit further through the timeline. So I told you about how President Obama had assembled a global health security unit within the National Security Council in 2014. In 2018, Trump fired this team. Now, he's since denied that he's done that. He actually lashed out at a Fox News reporter last week for referring to it. He calls it fake news, but he did it. He got rid of that team. We don't know why exactly. We don't know if it's part of his ongoing efforts to just erase every aspect of the Obama administration. Earlier this year, however, on camera, he said that it was a cost-cutting measure, that he didn't like to pay to have pandemic experts around when there wasn't a pandemic. And he said that if there ever was one, that it would be easy to hire them back again. He made this comment this February, long after he had been alerted to the actual current threat. All right, Kathy asks, when are we going to receive our much-needed stimulus checks? And this is a good question. And the answer seems to be shifting. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin had made it seem like it would have been happening already. Americans with direct deposit bank account information on file with the IRS, in other words, if you usually get a refund from the IRS, you're going to get this payment in the same way. It's going to come to you, just direct deposit to your bank account, and those should, according to the most recent estimates, come out in a few weeks. Those who don't may have to wait up to 4 months to receive their checks in the mail if you're counting on having it physically mailed to you. There may well still be time to file a tax return if you have not yet for the previous year, for 2019, even though the deadline has been extended until July 15th. There is nothing to stop you from filing it earlier and thereby getting your direct deposit information on record with the IRS. All right, in this timeline, so Trump fired the pandemic response team in 2018. Also in 2018, he cut the CDC epidemic prevention funding, which caused it to downsize in 39 countries, including China. Would have been nice if the CDC had had a more active presence in China last year to see what was developing there, wouldn't it? Now, Reuters reports that the White House National Security Council was first briefed about the current threat of the coronavirus on December 31st of 2019. The National Security Council has disputed that. They say it was January 3rd. Either way, we are talking about the end of December, the beginning of January. On January 8th, the CDC issued its first warning. On January 9th, President Trump held a rally. On January 14th, he held a rally. On January 18th, he held a rally. Meanwhile, all this time during the month of January, roughly 4,000 travelers from China were arriving in the United States on a daily basis. I'm sorry, did I say 4,000? I meant 14,000. 14,000 travelers from China were arriving on a daily basis, according to the White House's own estimates in January. And so when President Trump talks about what a good job he did stopping travel from China, let's remember that he did it after people were already coming in who had been exposed to the coronavirus. Okay. Now we've got another question from Lynn. Lynn asks, does 5G make the virus stronger? And the answer is no. This is a baseless conspiracy theory. While celebrities like John Cusack and Woody Harrelson have recklessly spread the theory into the mainstream with posts on Twitter and Instagram, actual scientists told the BBC that the conspiracy theory connection between 5G and the coronavirus is, quote, complete rubbish and biologically impossible. It's very important to not get your information from unreliable sources like John Cusack or, in many instances, the President of the United States. Please turn to actual medical experts for medical advice. So, folks, keep putting your questions in there, and we will keep pulling them. It does appear that the President is somewhat delayed, and I see that the team there in the White House is busy climbing up on ladders and adjusting the lighting, and presumably their briefing will begin soon. So we were talking about January. January, when 14,000 travelers from China were arriving in the U.S. per day. We know from the Washington Post's reporting that on January 18th, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar tried to have an urgent phone call with the president about the crisis, and Trump reportedly cut him off to berate him about his handling of an attempt to ban vaping, and then got off the call and went golfing. On January 19th, the next day, he went golfing again. On January 20th, this is an important day. This is the day that both South Korea and the United States confirmed their first cases of the coronavirus. And it is important to note another country that spotted its first case on the same day, because it helps answer the hypothetical question, what would have happened if we had acted sooner? And we will never know exactly for sure, but we can look at what South Korea did as an example of how a country could respond and what could happen if it responded that way. South Korea implemented widespread testing for the coronavirus within the first 2 weeks. The U.S. did not. The U.S. did not implement widespread testing until March. Again, this is after the first case appeared in the U.S. on January 20th. Now, on January 22nd, President Trump was asked whether he was worried. He said, quote, no, not at all. And he said, we have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China. It's going to be just fine. Now, on January 23rd, China shut down the entire city of Wuhan. This should have been very alarming if the previous warnings that had come the president's way were not. This was significantly enough alarming to Senator Chuck Schumer that he called for a public health emergency, which the president did not do, at least not yet. On January 27th, candidate Joe Biden wrote an op-ed warning that Trump was already failing in his response to the coronavirus. On January 28th, Elizabeth Warren released a plan for how to fight the coronavirus. That night, President Trump held a rally. The next day, January 29th, there's another memo from Navarro. This is where he said, this is the initial memo from Navarro, where he first raised the flag that millions of Americans' lives could be at risk. Only then did President Trump finally form a task force to address the issue. The State Department also at that time, after the city of Wuhan was shut down because the coronavirus was so widespread, the U.S. State Department worked to bring home 6,000 Americans who were in Wuhan. All right, we've got some more questions coming in. Debbie asks, Oregon has a very successful mail ballot system. Why isn't the rest of the U.S. implementing this system? And that is such a good question. Vote by mail has been very successful in several states, including Oregon and Colorado. It is a much fairer way to vote because in-person voting creates obstacles for people with disabilities. It creates obstacles for people who can't get out of their shifts at work. It creates obstacles for parents who don't have someone to take care of their children. And when there's a global pandemic, it brings people into direct contact with each other. By sheer coincidence, Washington State went from a caucus system to a mail-in primary ballot system this year, and it was so fortunate that they did because at the time that Washington State held its primary, Washington was the state with the highest death toll from the coronavirus, and so we have seen mail-in ballots save voters from disenfranchisement, and they can save lives. Now, President Trump says that he is adamantly opposed to mail-in voting. Last Friday, he was asked about it, and he made baseless claims that it would lead to cheating. He says bad things can happen once you put your ballot in the mail. I have a stat that Ian McKenna from our newsroom pulled up about the impact of mail-in voting in states where it takes place. And oh, my cat is walking across my keyboard. I apologize for that. I told you that we are all doing these briefings from our homes. We do not have access to our usual studio equipment. So here from my own home, this is Mew, the fluffy cat. Mew has walked across the keyboard and nearly just turned off this whole live stream. So I apologize for that. Mew, you've had your moment in the sun. Thank you. You are a star, Mew. I want to pull up the stat that Ian from our newsroom pulled on mail-in ballots. All right, so Oregon was the pioneer in this area, and since Oregon went to a mail-in system, the state has sent out more than 100 mail-in ballots. They went to this system in 2000, and in that basically 20 years of running vote by mail, Oregon has had roughly a dozen cases of fraud. A dozen cases in 20 years. Not a measurable number of cases. Not a real problem. President Trump has when he is not saying things that are false, he often says things that are so disarmingly true that you're not quite prepared for it. In an interview with Fox and Friends, he specifically said what they refer to these days as saying the quiet part out loud. He said that efforts to increase access to voting was, quote, crazy, and that it would lead to, quote, levels of voting that if you agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again. And this is a thing where Democrats in general want all the people who are legally eligible to vote. And by legally eligible, I mean they want U.S. citizens. They want all U.S. citizens over the age of 18 to be able to vote. Republicans want to impose obstacles, want to make it harder for people to vote. And that does, I mean, it's a little disappointing, and it does sort of call into question if the actual arguments, the political arguments they're making, are maybe not the best arguments if their strategy for winning is to make it as hard for people as possible to vote. Mail-in voting continues to grow in popularity and has increased steadily over the past 2 decades. There are 5 states now that do mail-in voting. That's Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, and Utah. They mail all registered voters a ballot before every election, and California is moving increasingly in that direction. And voting rights advocates say there is no excuse to not go to mail-in voting. Now, here's the thing. If we were to go to mail-in voting for this November's election, there's time now to do it if we act now. But it's not something you can just decide to put in place a few weeks before the election. It is a very large undertaking. Not a difficult undertaking for states that already do it, but for states to suddenly start doing it, we need to be taking action now. And that is actually why there is a strong push to include provisions to at least allow for the possibility of nationwide mail-in voting in the next bill, whatever the next bill is that deals with the coronavirus. If we are to protect the rights of Americans to vote against the possibility that we might still be in a shelter-in-place situation in November, those steps need to be taken right now. And you might want to call your senators and your representative and encourage them to support that. If you don't want to be waiting in a line in a physical location in November, start talking to your elected officials now. All right. More people are asking about the 5G thing. Folks, it's not a thing. It's not a thing. The coronavirus is a virus. It is a biological thing. It is not in any way related to the service on your phone. It may be related to the screen of your phone. If you are touching your phone with dirty hands, if you are placing your phone up against your face and you haven't cleaned your phone is a lot filthier than you know. Washing your hands does nothing if you don't also clean your phone. So guys, please clean your phone. Totally. You should do it. Yeah, that is the situation on that. Well, I apologize for the delay from the President of the United States. I see he is tweeting, so I'm going to see if I can get a sense of what it is that is occupying him. Oh, well, right now he is tweeting a clip from the Laura Ingraham show. Well, this is interesting. He's tweeting a clip from the Laura Ingraham show where she is promoting hydroxychloroquine. This is an interesting thing. President Trump has been very actively promoting hydroxychloroquine to a really kind of astonishing degree. He's brought it up so many times. Let's see, how many times did he bring it up last week? I think more times than I can count. So he has been pushing for it. On Sunday, he even suggested that he himself would just start taking it without the advice of a doctor. Just start taking it. Well, yesterday, the New York Times reported that he may have a financial stake in Sanofi, one of the companies that produces hydroxychloroquine. There also are ties, he also has ties to another company that produces it. And that company, so I'm just pulling up the name of it. There's another company that produces it, and which paid $1.2 million to his then lawyer Michael Cohen to gain access to the president. NowThis is the company. They also make hydroxychloroquine, and yes, in 2017, they paid Michael Cohen $1.2 million. Now, they have denied that there is any kind of pay-for-play, quid pro quo, tit-for-tat situation going on. And when queried by reporters, they have said that they will, in fact, end up donating their hydroxychloroquine to any relief efforts. But the president has been pushing this theory, this unfounded theory that this drug is useful. There have been only 3 studies in the world. None of the 3 studies has been conclusive, and there have been serious problems raised with all 3 of the studies. All right, somebody else asks, do you know how bad New York City will get, and why they're saying the curve is getting straight? All right, well, no one knows exactly how bad the situation in New York City will get. We currently have, let me just double check these, yes, currently in New York City there are at least nearly 77,000 confirmed cases, and there have been over 5,400 deaths. And while there was encouraging news in the past couple of days, 2 days in a row, New York State saw a slowing down in the rate of deaths and hospitalizations. But in the past 24 hours, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo said that the state saw its highest single-day death toll since the virus hit. 731 people died in the last 24 hours. Cuomo has been reiterating the importance of continuing social distancing and saying to stay inside as much as possible despite any reported numbers, warning New Yorkers that, quote, if we get reckless, you will see these numbers go up again. So the numbers of the past couple days have given some reason to hope that the New York may be moving away from the worst point of this, but it may still be a long, painful path ahead of us. Just bringing us up to speed on today's numbers, there are 1.4 million cases globally. In the U.S., there are nearly 387,000 cases. The global deaths have been over 81,000. In the U.S., there have been over 12,000 deaths. More than 4 times as many people have been killed by the coronavirus in the U.S. as were killed on the attacks from 9/11. New York State, as I mentioned, has has over 138,000 cases and has suffered over 5,400 deaths. New York City has 77,000 cases. And on the bright side, it is important to remember that there have been nearly 300,000 recoveries in the world. Most people who get this will end up being okay. This weekend, Governor Cuomo announced that 74% of New Yorkers who have been hospitalized have since gone on to recover and have been dismissed from the hospital. They needed the hospitalization to survive, but it's important to remember, for most people, this will be something that you can get over on your own. Here in my household, my wife has been dealing with something that appears that it could perhaps be the coronavirus. Due to a lack of testing, we may never know for sure, but she has had an extended cough, heaviness in her chest, difficulty with smelling and tasting, and she went through a stretch of time where she would have a fever that would come and go. These are symptoms that are consistent with the coronavirus. She is recovering well. She's going to be, by all indications, she's going to be just fine, as most people are and will be. But it makes me very thankful, not just for the health of our own household, but that we did not follow our initial impulse to go and spend this time with one of my 70-something parents in another state. We could have, if we had left at the time that this all began, we could have unwittingly brought an infection with us and infected someone in a much higher risk group. And that is what everyone needs to be careful about. The best advice that I have seen is don't change your behavior to protect yourself from infection. Change your behavior to assume that you are infected and protect others. That is how we are going to save lives from this. We have more questions coming in. Please keep posting your questions in the comments. As long as the president is still tweeting clips from Laura Ingraham, he's I guess, not going to be walking in here just yet. He's also tweeting that he's going to be on Fox News this evening, on Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity is another Fox News personality who has been using his show to promote hydroxychloroquine, which again is an experimental drug, experimental for the purposes of treating the coronavirus. It has not been confirmed to have a positive effect. President Trump has said repeatedly, at least 3 times in a single briefing, what do you have to lose by taking it? And the answer is potentially your life. There are very serious side effects associated with the coronavirus. There are studies indicating that it has potentially lethal interactions with a common diabetes drug. There are cardiac side effects that can in some cases lead to cardiac arrest. There are psychiatric side effects. So please, just because the President of the United States is suggesting you should take a drug that he may potentially have a stake in financial stake in 2 companies that produce, just because he is saying that doesn't mean that you should do it. You should instead respect the guidance of your doctor. All right, Jim asks a question. Oh, and I have good news. We just got the 2-minute warning. The President of the United States will be coming out any minute now with his coronavirus task force. They will be conducting the briefing. A couple things to be on the lookout for. See if he promotes hydroxychloroquine again today. Just see if he does. It's really curious. It's almost become an odd little tick for him to promote it. See how he responds to questions from the press. When he is in a bad mood, he can really tend to lay into the press. It is worth noting that he does it most seriously against women journalists of color. All right, we now see that 3 members of the administration have stepped out. Dr. Birx, Seema Verma, the administrator of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and Tony Fauci. I'd like you to note that all 3 of them are staying at least 6 feet away from each other. They are modeling good social distancing behavior. Typically, the President of the United States does not demonstrate good social distancing behavior when he comes out for these briefings. All right, so Jim asks, do people build up immunity or can you have a reoccurrence? Is there antibody testing yet? And Shelby Vacklin from our newsroom, thank you for flagging that question. The answer is that last week the FDA approved the first coronavirus antibody test in the U.S., and this test could help scientists learn just how widespread the infection is, how long people remain immune after recovering, and help researchers calculate a more precise death rate. Per the New York Times reporting, the new test looks only for the presence of the antibodies and delivers a qualitative yes or no answer. It does not say how well the antibodies are working. Some people who are infected produce powerful immune responses, others do not, and scientists do not know how long immunity to this virus may last.
The assumptive diagnosis was correct. I don't like to make mistakes. My own grandchildren.
Dr. Birx has just given an update on her own grandchild. She has a granddaughter who has been suffering from a fever. But unfortunately, I didn't hear what the verdict was, but I see that Dr. Birx is smiling, so that is good news. And now here is the President of the United States. We will attempt to fact-check him in real time.
Today we continue to send our love to the great people of New York and New Jersey. We support them fully. We grieve alongside every family who has lost a precious loved one. New Yorkers are tough and strong and brave. And they're being hit very hard right now.
I want to call to your attention, the President is saying very appropriate things. He is reading from scripted remarks. A pattern that you may have noticed is that when he is reading his scripted remarks, he has words of empathy for states that are going through this crisis. When he is speaking off the cuff, he tends to lash out at the governors of these states and sometimes even the doctors and nurses themselves.
So we pray for Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He's become a great friend of ours. He loves this country. He loves his country. But he loves the USA, and he's always been very good to us. Whenever we had difficulty, he was with us, and we appreciate it. So we pray for Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He's going through a lot. As we intensify our military campaign against the virus, I think that it must be brought out that we have to thank the American people for continuing to follow our guidelines on slowing the spread, an expression that more and more people are thinking about. Nobody ever heard of it 2 months ago, and now everybody is talking about slowing the spread, stopping the spread.
The President is falsely saying that nobody had ever heard of this 2 months ago. We walked through some of the early alerts earlier that the President got. We know that the National Security Council was warned about this disease by January 3rd at the absolute latest.
Monster we're fighting. But signs are that our strategy is totally working. Every American has a role to play in winning this war, and we're going to be winning it, and we're going to be winning it powerfully, and we'll be prepared for the next one.
The President keeps comparing this to a war and saying that we are winning it. It is important to note that the President has estimated that the death toll from this will be anywhere from 2 to 4 times that of the Vietnam War. So if the Vietnam War was a win, this is less of a win than that.
Flights are scheduled in the near future over the next couple of weeks. The Army Corps of Engineers is constructing facilities that will support more than 15,000 hospital beds to treat patients in need. So they're building now approximately 15,000. They just completed the big one in New York. They just completed and are in the process of continuing in Chicago and many other places. They're incredible. The Army Corps of Engineers, we owe them a lot. What they were able to do in such a short period of time. They'll build these massive facilities, 2,000 beds in 4 days. So it's really something very special. I know I was in the construction industry, and You don't see that happen very often. I want to remind governors and emergency managers that sharing real-time data with us about equipment and their needs is very important. All of their supplies, hospital occupancy is critical. A lot of the occupancy is really getting a little bit lower than anticipated, and that's good. We sort of thought that was going to happen. And we're getting along very well with the governors. This whole situation with respect to talking to us about equipment and equipment needs, giving us a little bit of lead time, so important. All the supplies, we're getting it to everybody.
The president keeps suggesting that the supply levels at hospitals are good. We have all accounts report the exact opposite, and one of the things that upset the president most in yesterday's briefing was a reference to a report from the Health and Human Services Inspector General, which found that hospitals across the country in 46 states that were surveyed were facing severe shortages of personal protective equipment, ventilators, testing supplies, and staff.
To the four leading, I call them the genius companies, they're doing incredibly well with respect to cures and also with respect to a vaccine that's going to protect us, totally protect us. And they have some great potential. It's going to take a little while yet, but they have some great potential, some great early results.
The president is suggesting that we can look forward to cures and vaccines. There is no cure at this point for the coronavirus, and the most encouraging vaccine study is about a year away.
Governor fails. If you have a governor that's failing, we're going to protect you. But the governors are working well with us over the last period of time.
The president is referring to failures of governors. He has repeatedly tried to pin the blame for this crisis on the governors and not on his own response.
675 ventilators right now in stock, ready to move. And we have all sorts of incredible soldiers. Our military is going to move them should they be needed. In, as an example, if we need additional in New York or the New York City area, you have state, you have city, and spoke to Mayor de Blasio, and we've really have a great, well-coordinated campaign with Mayor de Blasio. It's been really good. Spoke to Governor Cuomo. There's been great coordination. So if they need something, we have it. If Louisiana needs something, we have it. Same thing with Michigan. Same thing with Illinois. There are certain spots that are very hot, and we'll see what happens. But we'll know pretty much we'll have time, and we'll be able to move it. In addition to the 8,675 ventilators, we have 2,200 arriving on April 13th. We have 5.
Now, the president is saying that he's providing enough supplies and ventilators in particular to states. Just reviewing recent numbers that I had, New York was anticipating a need of nearly 40,000 ventilators and has only gotten 4,400 from the government. New York's Governor Cuomo said that he had more success at getting ventilators from China and from the state of Oregon. President Trump mentioned the state of Louisiana. Louisiana's governor has requested 14,000 ventilators and has only gotten a couple hundred from the federal government. Illinois requested 4,000 and got roughly 450. New Jersey requested 2,500 and got 850. Virginia requested 350. I am checking to see if there's been an update, but when we last heard, Virginia had not received any. It's also worth noting that a review of federal purchasing contracts by the Associated Press shows that federal agencies largely waited until mid-March to begin placing bulk orders of N95 respirator masks, mechanical ventilators, and other equipment needed for frontline workers. Remember that the president was warned of this crisis on January 3rd, and that multiple states had declared statewide states of emergency before that.
They went away from this great country and they had them produced elsewhere, so we're going to start bringing them back. I've been talking about that for a long time, not only with medical, but lots of other things. America continues to perform more tests than any other nation in the world, and I think that's probably why we have more cases.
The president is misrepresenting the case when he says that the U.S. is performing more cases. The U.S. has, I believe, just reached over 2 million tests so far, which is maybe the largest raw number, but in testing per capita, the U.S. ranks 41st in the world. The U.S. waited until the beginning of March to start widespread testing as compared to, say, South Korea, which began nationwide widespread testing within 2 weeks of the first diagnosis, which for South Korea was the same date as the U.S. in January on the 20th.
Engaging on the problem of increased impacts. This is a real problem, and it's showing up very strongly in our data on the African American community, and we're doing everything in our power to address this challenge. It's a tremendous challenge. It's terrible. And provide support to African American citizens of this country who are going through a lot, but it's been disproportional. They're getting hit very, very hard. In fact, while we have Tony here, I'd like to maybe have you come up and address that one, and then I'll continue. But if you could.
What the president says is true. The African American community is being hit more directly by the coronavirus. We'll hear what Dr. Fauci has to say, and then I'll say more.
Literally forever, that diseases like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and asthma are disproportionately afflicting the minority populations, particularly the African Americans. Unfortunately, when you look at the predisposing conditions that lead to a bad outcome with coronavirus, the things that get people into ICUs, that require intubation and often lead to death, they are just those very comorbidities that are unfortunately disproportionately prevalent in the African American population. So we're very concerned about that. It's very sad. It's nothing we can do about it right now except to try and give them the best possible care to avoid those complications. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And Tony, I think you're going to have some pretty accurate numbers over the next few days, right? But they are they're very nasty numbers, terrible numbers. In total, 1,200 Abbott machines. Abbott laboratories have been fantastic.
So just to continue on the point a little bit more of how Black Americans are impacted more severely by the coronavirus. Yesterday, Governor John Bel Edwards of Louisiana announced that 70% of the state's deaths were Black citizens, and we now know that there are similar percentages in Milwaukee and Chicago, that roughly 70% of the deaths have been Black citizens. So it is important to remember that when the President of the United States said in his pitch to Black voters, "What the hell do you have to lose?" The answer, as so many Americans are seeing, is potentially your life.
And some people are getting to know each other, frankly. Some families are getting to know each other on a positive note, but there are a lot of people struggling. On Thursday, I'll be speaking to leaders and advocates from the mental health organizations all across our country, and we are going to be talking about resources and tools that we'll make available to them. They need help, and it's a big problem. When you take something where it was the most successful country in the world, still is, the whole world is shut down. Think of it, we're down to numbers that are incredible. As I said yesterday, I think it's 182 countries right now. 182 countries are under attack by
it is actually 184 countries. President Trump has consistently gotten this number wrong to various degrees.
So speeding economic relief to our people, it's incredible. We just had a meeting that was absolutely incredible with the banks. I spoke with leaders in the banking and finance industry about our efforts to help American workers and employers. As of today, small business has processed more than $70 billion in guaranteed loans, and will provide much-needed relief for nearly 250,000 businesses already. So we are going to be providing tremendous amounts of money to the small businesses of our country who have been absolutely clobbered.
There have been some serious problems with the rollout of these small business loans. According to Forbes, banks are finding themselves overwhelmed and many are unable to start taking applications. It's also important to note that the purpose of these loans and these bailout policies is that companies are being urged to keep their staff on. President Trump's organization, his businesses, have laid off at least 1,500 workers.
Group, Al Kelly, CEO of Visa, Michael Miebach, CEO of MasterCard, Noah Wilcox, CEO, Chairman of Grand Rapids State Bank, and we had numerous others also on the call, and I just appreciate them. We're way ahead of schedule, by the way. We're way ahead of schedule. The Paycheck Protection Program has been incredible. So based on the incredible success of the program, I'm announcing that I'll be asking Congress to provide an additional $250 billion for the Paycheck Protection, which will help keep Americans employed to facilitate a quick and full recovery. We're doing very well. We're looking very bipartisan. A lot of people want to do it. And the plan is amazing. You know, they're processing hundreds of thousands of loans. And this is the big banks that are doing it, the community banks. But the biggest banks right now in our country are doing it, and they're doing it for a lot of reasons. One of them is they want to help people. The WHO, that's the World Health Organization, receives vast amounts of money from the United States, and we pay for a majority, a biggest portion of their money. And they actually criticized and disagreed with my travel ban at the time I did it, and they were wrong. They've been wrong about a lot of things. And they had a lot of information early, and they didn't want to. They seemed to be very China-centric. And we have to look into that. So we're going to look into it. We give a majority of the money that they get. And it's much more than the 58 $58 million is a small portion of what they've gotten over the years. Sometimes they get much more than that. Sometimes it's for programs that they're doing. And
I'm looking up the numbers on how much the U.S. contributes to the World Health Organization's budget. President Trump frequently misrepresents this type of number, so I want to make sure that we're pulling something accurate for you.
Earlier, they would have known, and they should have known, and they probably did know. So we'll be looking into that very carefully, and we're going to put a hold on money spent to the WHO. We're going to put a very powerful hold on it, and we're going to see. It's a great thing if it works, but when they call every shot wrong, that's no good. We're in the midst of a great national struggle, one that requires the shared sacrifice.
All right, well, right away, there's something that is absolutely false in what the president has said. He's saying that the World Health Organization missed this threat. The World Health Organization declared a global health emergency on January 30th. President Trump did not declare an emergency until March 13th. And the idea that we would be cutting off money to the World Health Organization in the midst of a global pandemic seems reckless and ill-advised. It's also important to note that the World Health Organization offered the U.S. tests in February. In February, the World Health Organization was announced that it would circulate over 250,000 tests around the world. We said, no, we won't take your tests. We'll make our own tests. And as a result, the U.S. did not begin widespread, consistent testing until March.
Are so far much better. We want to keep it that way. If you look at the original projections, if we did nothing, it would be disastrous. If we decided to do something, we closed it down, had no choice. It was a good move. That was a good move. The early China move was a good move. The early Europe move was a good move. We had a lot of good moves, but closing it down was a big statement. It was a big, important thing. But
President Trump has repeatedly mischaracterized his travel restrictions on China as being very early. They were, in fact, not very early. There was apparently debate within the National Security Council as to whether there should be travel shut down in January, but the actual restrictions did not go into effect until February, and they were not a complete ban. They were just restrictions. Vietnam issued a full ban in January when the U.S. did not. And during the time when the U.S. was waiting to put such a ban in place, there were roughly 14,000 travelers from China arriving per day in the U.S. We now know that as many as 300,000 people came into the U.S. from China during this outbreak before President Trump put any travel restrictions in place. And also, the World Health Organization did not condemn the travel restrictions.
This is all new territory. It unlocked the miracles of science, and we're doing that. I wish you could have heard the calls I had yesterday with these great companies that come up with cures to diseases, and the success they've had over the last 15 years is really amazing. So I just want to thank all of them. They're working very hard. They're working with UK right now, and the UK doctors hopefully helping with their great Prime Minister. But these people are really tremendous signs of success are staring us right in the face. I think we're going to have something that's going to be great in terms of vaccines and in terms of everything else that they're doing. Just really helping us, helping the people of our country, and helping ultimately the people of the world. So I want to thank you all for being here. I will take some questions, and then I'm going to give it over to the Vice President, and they're going to go into great detail onto what we're doing and all of the successful supplies and medical equipment that we're getting. All of the ventilators, I've said it, but you can go over it in more detail if you'd like, but we're taking in and building thousands and thousands of ventilators, and they're very high quality. I said, you got to go for the quality, and these are quality companies doing it.
All right. Well, the president is highlighting that finally ventilators are being produced. It is unfortunately too late for many areas of the nation. It takes time to produce ventilators. And while he was urged by the Pentagon and national security officials as far back as the first year of his administration to stock up the federal stockpile, he did not do so. And as a result, multiple governors are saying that their states are at risk of not having enough ventilators and at having doctors have to choose which patients live and which die.
You know, you shouldn't be writing letters, and you're in the military, you're the captain of a great ship, and you shouldn't be writing letters and sending them to many people, and then it gets out to the media. And, you know, the question is, how did it get out to the media? So there's a lot of bad things happen there. And I had heard he did because he didn't want to cause any disturbance for our country. So that was because he wouldn't have had to resign. I would not have asked him. I don't know him. I didn't speak to him. But he did that, I think, just to end that problem. And I think in really many ways that was a very unselfish thing for him to do.
What should happen now to Commander Crozier, who left?
Well, they're going to look at that. I think the Secretary of Defense, as you know, is Mark Esper, and he's very capable. And I think he's looking at that right now. They're going to just take it under regular Navy channels to see what they want to do.
All right. Now, the president is talking about Captain Brett Crozier of the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt. He had sounded an alarm that he was not being given what he needed to keep his sailors safe. He said, quote, sailors do not need to die. If we do not act now, we are failing to properly take care of our most trusted asset, our sailors. He was asking for the ability to implement quarantine and isolation procedures because the virus was spreading on the ship. And when this letter was leaked, he was relieved of duty. The Wall Street Journal and Washington Post have reported that it was at the direction of the President of the United States, which he has since denied. And sadly, after being relieved of duty, to the shock and horror of his crew who supported him, he himself tested positive for the coronavirus.
We're going to help the little companies. And the banks are running, nobody's equipped to do a thing like that, but the banks are equipped. So the banks are doing it, big banks, small banks. We have many banks, community banks, and they're processing the loans, and they'll be able to watch it and make sure it's done properly.
Talk today, sir, as well about potentially reopening the economy in the upcoming weeks. You mentioned the other day about a potential economic task force. Can you give us some sort of update as to where
We're
that may or
thinking
may
about
not...
that, but we want to open up. We want to get it open soon. That's why I think maybe we're getting to the very top of the curve. I spoke with Governor Cuomo, and he seems to think that he's getting close, and I think a lot of people think that a lot of places are getting close. We want to start hitting the downside, and I think we're going to be doing. This is going to be a very difficult week, however. This week will be a very difficult week because that's the most difficult week when you're at that top position, and we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
It does open up. What can the federal government do?
Now, what the president is saying is partly true there. There has been some encouraging news from New York that for 2 days in a row, the number of hospitalizations were down, and for two days, the number of deaths were down. But then within the past 24 hours, New York State suffered its single deadliest day since this started, with over 730 deaths in a single day.
George. And the dollar is very strong, and people are investing in the dollar. They want, the fact that we have the strong currency. We have the currency. Our currency is everything. And other companies, other countries want to be in our currency. So we're getting all of the investment wanting to come into the dollar. The dollar is the strength. The dollar is the whole ballgame. We have a strong dollar. Other currencies are going down, way, way down in some cases. You look at other countries, I won't mention them, but other countries are going down 22%, 25%, 28%, and it's very hard for them. That makes it much more difficult. With us, our currency is relatively now stronger than it ever was, or it was over the last few years relative to other countries. It's always relative to other countries, but our currency is very strong. So therefore, people want to invest. If we do a bond issue to do infrastructure, everybody wants a piece of that issue, even at zero interest. Yeah, please.
The U.S. dollar is not currently the strongest currency in the world. I'm checking on what is.
And how does these memos sort of square with what you've often said, that nobody could have predicted this? It sounds like he was predicting.
I didn't see him, but I heard he wrote some memos talking about pandemic. I didn't see him. I didn't look for him either. But that was about the same time as I felt that we should do it. That was about the same time that I closed it down. I asked him about it just a little while ago because I read something about a memo. I said, did you do a memo? I didn't look for it.
Okay, what the president is saying is not right now true. He's being asked about Peter Navarro's memos and the fact that Navarro seemed to see this coming when he did not, and he's saying that they were coming to the realization at the same time. That is not true. Navarro warned in a memo that millions of American lives were at risk on January 29th, and the president did not declare a state of emergency until March 13th. In the days following this memo from Navarro, he golfed. He golfed at least once, and he held a rally. He golfed again. He rallied. He rallied. He rallied. There was a second memo from Navarro. The day after the second memo, he tweeted out the coronavirus is very much under control in the USA. So what he's describing here is not true.
I'm also closing it down. I obviously was concerned about it because I closed down our country to China, which was heavily infected. I then closed it down to Europe. That's a big move, closing it down from China and then closing it down from Europe and then ultimately closing it down to the UK. So, and it was right about that time. But I'm not going to...
Again, this is not true what the president is saying about China. He did not fully close down travel, and the travel restrictions that he put into place did not go into place until February, after there had already been over several hundred thousand people had arrived from China in the U.S. during the time of the epidemic before he placed any travel restrictions.
Say it.
You learned about the memo today?
I read about it maybe a day ago, 2 days ago.
Do you feel like someone among your staff or Peter Navarro himself should have told you about the memo earlier?
No. It was a recommendation. It was a feeling that he had. I think he told certain people in the staff, but it didn't matter. I didn't see it, but I did. I closed it down. I don't remember it even being discussed. We had a meeting where there were a lot of people. Most people felt they should not close it down, that we shouldn't close down to China, but I felt we had to do it.
This is not true. This is something that the president has repeatedly said. He has repeatedly falsely claimed that he was the only one who wanted to shut it down and the others didn't. The decision was made in accord with advisement from public health officials. HHS Secretary Alex Azar said at the time that the decision was made following the, quote, uniform recommendation of the career public health officials here at HHS. Now, unfortunately, the decision was made quite late. Because, as I alluded to earlier, in January, before these restrictions went into place, 300,000 people arrived in the U.S. from China.
To this, but it didn't matter whether I saw it or not because I acted on my own. I guess I had the same instincts as Peter. Peter's a smart guy, and he's a good guy, and he's done a wonderful job. But he wrote a memo, and I guess he talked to various people about it. But ultimately, I did what the memo, more or less what the memo said, just about the time the memo came out. I closed it down. I took a lot of heat. The World, Health Organization was very much against. They didn't like it. They actually put out statements about it. In all fairness to Joe Biden, he called me xenophobic.
The president is again misrepresenting things. It is true that Joe Biden called him xenophobic. But not because of the travel ban. He did not criticize, again, also it wasn't a ban, it was a series of restrictions. He did not criticize the actual travel restrictions. The World Health Organization did not criticize the restrictions themselves. No Democratic leadership criticized the travel restrictions. This narrative that the president is giving is false.
Of them saying terrible things. But that was a great decision. If I didn't do it, if I didn't do that, we would have had hundreds of thousands more people dying.
Again, this is false. Dr. Jennifer Nuzzo, an epidemiologist at Johns Hopkins, has said, quote, "We have not seen any evidence that shows the travel restrictions stopped or slowed down the transmission of the virus that causes COVID. It is possible that it did, but there is no evidence to show this. Rather, there are numerous reasons to believe that this may very well not have been the case." And again, the reasons for this include the fact that there had been 300,000 people coming to the country from China in the previous month. The fact that these were not, in fact, a ban on travel, unlike Vietnam, which imposed a full travel ban on China. U.S. citizens were still free to come and go from China, and flight crew from Chinese travel were also coming and going.
And then ultimately, when I closed it down, they actually said that I made a mistake in closing it down, and it turned out to be right. But at the time, they did that. So we're just going to take a look at it. We fund it, and they seem to be, I said recently in social media, I said they seem to be very China-centric. That's a nice way of saying it, but they seem to be very China-centric. And they seem to err always on the side of China. And we fund it, so I want to look into it. Yes, please.
Thanks. A quick follow-up on that. So is it time to freeze funding to the WHO during a pandemic?
No, maybe not. I mean, I'm not saying I'm going to do it, but we're going to look at it.
You did say that.
We give a tremendous, no, I didn't. I said we're going to look at it. We're going to investigate it. We're going to look at it. But we will look at ending funding. Yeah. Because you know what? They called it wrong. And if you look back over the years even, they're very much...
The World Health Organization did not call the travel restrictions wrong.
You talked about African Americans and how they've been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus.
Seems to be, unfortunately.
Do you plan on requiring the CDC, any federal agencies or state agents, public public places doing tests and private companies doing tests to collect that data on the race of the people being tested and the race of the people being treated and the outcome.
Well, we're just seeing tremendous evidence that African Americans are affected at a far greater percentage number than other citizens of our country, because we're dealing with our country. Now we're looking at it from a worldwide standpoint. Tony Fauci is looking at it.
What the president is saying there is actually true. The data show that Black Americans are being the most affected disproportionately by this. Let's see what Seema Burma has to say.
To do that analysis, we're going to look back at the last month or so and look at, related type illnesses going forward. We now have a code for coronavirus, so we can actually stratify by demographic information, so we can look at race as a factor. We can also look at what the underlying health issues are as well. So we'll be providing that data very shortly, but we will be doing that analysis.
We're working on that very hard. This is something that's come up over the last, I hadn't heard this, and then over the last few days this has come up more and more.
And it is very alarming data. Just to highlight one city's example, Chicago is 30% Black, but more than half of the coronavirus cases in Chicago are Black Chicagoans, and Black Chicagoans account for 72% of the deaths in Chicago from the coronavirus. Again, Black citizens are only 30% of the city's whole population.
They're going to have very good, I would say over the next, in less than a week, I think you're going to have very good statistics. Couple of days.
Something specifically aimed at those communities that are being hard hit, those Black communities.
Well,
that
we're
are being hard
helping them
hit.
a lot. But what's happening is we're trying to find out why is it that it's 3 and 4 times. Now, maybe that's not going to be the final number, but why is it 3 or 4 times more so for the Black community as opposed to other people? It doesn't make sense, and I don't like it. And we're going to have statistics over the next probably 2 to 3 days, okay?
Mr. President.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question on behalf of myself and a colleague who couldn't be here due to social distancing. Thank you.
Who are you with? Who?
With Hearst Newspapers. I'm the print cooler today. Thank you. Some banks are only providing Paycheck Protection Program loans to clients with whom they have existing banking relationships. And you spoke to banking CEOs today. I wonder if you'll ask them, these lenders, to accept applications from all small businesses, not just the businesses with whom they have existing
Okay, they'll be doing that.
relationships.
But we're also working with small community banks, so they will be doing that. It's a question I've already spoken about. I mean, in many cases, they have long-term relationships with thousands of companies. I was amazed to see how many, you saw the number of applications. It's hundreds of thousands. It's a lot of work. But I did ask that question, and they are working on that. Yeah.
Thank you. And my second question from a colleague is Congressman Jerry Connolly, a Democrat from Northern Virginia, told the local DC CBS station that you personally requested the CARES Act stimulus bill be stripped of $25 billion for the Postal Service. Connolly claims that unless the USPS gets that $25 billion, the agency will be run out of money by June. He accuses you of hastening the demise of the Postal Service. Could you respond to that, please?
I'm the reason the Postal Service has lost billions of dollars every year for many, many years. I'm the demise. This is the new one. I'm now the demise of the Postal Service. I'll tell you who's the demise of the Postal Service. So these internet companies that give their stuff to the Postal Service, packages, and I don't know why they're not, I don't run the Postal Service. You have a group of people, so-called independent people, and they run it. But these packages are, they lose money every time they deliver a package for Amazon or these other internet companies, these other companies that deliver. They drop everything in the post office. They say, you deliver it. And if they'd raise the prices by actually a lot, then you'd find out that the post office could make money or break even. But they don't do that. And I'm trying to figure out why. These are independent boards. They were appointed by other administrations. They're sort of long-term.
The president has repeatedly spread false conspiracy theories about the post office and particularly how it deals with Amazon. He has a long-standing beef with Amazon because Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, also owns the Washington Post, and President Trump does not like the Washington Post's coverage. He has falsely claimed in the past that Amazon has a special discount with the Postal Service. This is not true. He's now suggesting that the Postal Service needs to raise its rates. Something that is very magnificent about the Postal Service is that it allows low-cost delivery for every citizen. As a private shipping company can choose not to deliver to certain places, the U.S. Postal Service delivers everywhere. It was Benjamin Franklin's brainchild, and he viewed it as essential to our democracy, and it actually is an example of our government working, in my opinion, at its finest.
Focus on that, because if he focused on that, he could truly save the post office. Post office has been losing billions of dollars a year for many, many years. And have him take a look at that, because that's the way to solve the problem.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Thank you so much. Mr. President, you say this week will be very painful, very difficult, but a few weeks ago you said this was just like a flu. What have you learned?
Also, just on the sheer numbers of it, the idea that the Postal Service is losing money on Amazon deliveries, this is false. The Postal Service is actually making money off of this. President Trump's own administration released numbers and told the New York Times that, quote, the commercial package delivery for Amazon and other e-commerce retailers was actually profitable for the Postal Service and was not costing the United States massive amounts of money, as President Trump has suggested. Also, USPS spokesman told a news outlet that some 230 postal employees have tested positive for coronavirus. And while the Postal Service can confirm some deaths, the agency does not yet have a definitive number. So again, the threats to the Postal Service, the greatest threats, do not appear to be Amazon or Jeff Bezos.
That is now closing up. Well, the UK was an example. Now, they talk about Sweden, but Sweden is suffering very gravely. You know that, right? Sweden did that. The herd, they call it the herd. Sweden's suffering very, very badly. It's a way of doing it, but everybody has been watching everybody else. And so far, almost every country has done it the way we've done it. We've chosen to do it. If we didn't do it that way, we would have lost hundreds of thousands of more people. Okay.
Mr. President, there's voting going on today in Wisconsin. There are reports of thousands of people waiting in hours-long lines as they've had to weigh their own personal health and their civic responsibility. Do you think that the Supreme Court was right in its decision that voting should go forward and the absentee extension should not take place?
Yeah. Look, the Supreme Court, of course they were right, because what the Democrats wanted, and you know what this happened. I supported a man named Justice Kelly, who's Daniel Kelly, highly respected justice. And I supported him just the other day, social media. I know of him. He's just a fantastic justice. And I endorsed him. And as soon as I endorsed him, they wanted to move the election. They didn't want to move the election. As soon as I endorsed him.
This is a preposterous false claim that Wisconsin only wished to postpone its elections because of President Trump endorsing a candidate. At least 15 states have delayed their primaries and local elections because of the ongoing health crisis.
At the end of the election, they wanted to have 1 week for proxies to come in, or mail ballots. Now, mail ballots, they cheat, okay? People cheat. Mail ballots are a very dangerous thing for this country because they're cheaters.
President Trump is making a claim that is not based in any fact. He himself voted by mail in Florida's primary. I hope that he did not cheat. I don't know if he's making an admission here when he says that people who vote by mail are cheaters. The fact of the matter is, as we highlighted earlier, Oregon, the pioneer in this area, who has been sent out more than 100 million ballots over the past 20 years, has only ever documented about a dozen cases of fraud. There is no widespread problem of voter fraud in the U.S., and on the rare occasions when it is found, it has most often been found to be committed by Republicans.
No problem with the election being today until I endorsed the Republican candidate, Justice Kelly, Daniel Kelly. And as soon as I endorsed him, they went crazy. They went crazy. And you know that's true. And now all of a sudden, because go back 2 weeks, go back 2 days, they didn't want to move the election. They were having the election. They were fine because they thought they were going to win the election.
Again, 15 states have postponed their elections. The idea that Wisconsin's desire to postpone the election was motivated by a tweet of President Trump on behalf of a candidate is preposterous. There are to date over 2,500 cases of coronavirus in Wisconsin, and there have been over 92 deaths. And that is the reason why Wisconsin sought to move its election.
The side effects are the least of it. You have people dying all over the place. And generally, the side effects are really with the Z-Pack having to do with the heart. The Z-Pack, that's the antibiotic, not with the hydroxychloroquine. So a woman last night, I watched...
President Trump is back on hydroxychloroquine, which the New York Times has reported he may have a financial stake in. There are at least 2 companies that make hydroxychloroquine which do seem to have financial ties to President Trump. He has made a series of claims about the drug that have not been backed up by science. Let's hear what else he has to say now.
I think she said that her doctor said it's going to be very tough. She saw me talking about this, and she asked her husband to go to the drugstore. Now, this is a Democrat representative, a person that, perhaps wouldn't be voting for me. I think she'll be voting for me now, even if she's a Democrat, even if she's a Democrat representative. And they went to the store, which I made available because we have millions of doses. We have, I think, 29 million doses of this drug. And she asked her husband, she said, please go out.
Now, it is true that President Trump has purchased 29 million doses of hydroxychloroquine for the National Strategic Stockpile. This has actually caused a problem for people who rely upon this drug for health conditions which it actually is proven to treat, such as rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. They are finding a shortage of the drug.
There's a woman that thought she was going to die. She's a Democrat representative, highly respected woman. African-American woman. I don't know if you saw it. As you asked a question about African-American, she was an African-American woman, a great woman. Her manner of speaking, the way she told the story was beautiful. I asked my husband to go and get it. He got it. She is now okay. She was interviewed last night on television. And she thanked me. She thanked me even in a tweet. She said, I want to thank President Trump. He saved my life. Look, I don't say that happens with everybody, but that's a beautiful story. There are many of those stories. And I say, try it. Okay, please. If you're in trouble, if you're going to die, and you're going to die, you're not going to die from this pill. Now, there could be some side effects, but the side effects is really more so from the Z-Pack.
Okay, what the president is saying is very dangerous. The president just said, try it. Please, I cannot stress this strongly enough. Do not take a medication that has not been prescribed by a doctor for that purpose. He's dismissing the side effects. It actually poses very serious side effects in some cases. There is evidence to suggest that it can have a lethal interaction with a common diabetes drug. In some cases, it can lead to cardiac arrest. There are psychiatric side effects, and there has been no meaningful clinical study showing that this can indeed treat or prevent deaths from the coronavirus. The most positive studies suggest that it may have increased the healing time of patients who were not very sick, but there is no indication that it has reduced the number of deaths, intubations, or heart failure.
See it, to believe it, the way she spoke, it was like a miracle. And this was not a fan of mine, but she's a fan of mine now, and I'm very honored by it. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Can you talk about your decision to remove Glenn Fine from the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee? And
that move and some of the criticism you've leveled at IGs, how does the American public have confidence that there'll be oversight?
Well, we have a lot of IGs in from the Obama era, and as you know, it's a presidential decision, and I left them largely. I mean, changed some, but I left them. But when we have, reports of bias, and when we have different things coming in, I don't know Fine. I don't think I ever met Fine. I heard the name.
It wasn't an Obama.
I heard the name. I don't know where he is. Maybe he was from Clinton. Okay, you check that out. Okay, maybe he's from Clinton. But we did change him. But we changed a number. We have about 7 nominations in, I believe. We put 7 very, very highly qualified people for the IG position. And, that's a decision that I could have made 3 years ago and I could have made 2 years ago. And but we're putting in, not so much for him, we're putting in 7 names. I think it was 7. And they're going in now. Yeah.
Mr. President, when you talk about the WHO being China-centric, what exactly are you talking about? Is it because China is underplayed how many
I
victims
don't know.
they've
They
had?
seem to come down on the side of China. Don't close your borders to China. Don't do this. They don't report what's really going on. They didn't see it, and yet they were there. They didn't see what was going on in Wuhan.
This is just patently false when President Trump says that the World Health Organization did not see the emerging crisis. The World Health Organization issued a warning long before it seemed to be on his radar. And also the criticism of the World Health Organization being China-centric is a little ironic, given how frequently, when this started, President Trump was praising China as the virus spread across the country in the month of February. Trump repeatedly praised President Xi, saying, quote, he's handled it really well and that he's doing a very good job with a tough situation.
Candidate that's highly qualified, very respected person. And all hell broke loose as soon as I did that. And then all of a sudden they want to change. Before I endorsed him, they didn't want to change this voting area. There was no problem with the Democrats voting until I endorsed the candidate. Then they said, let's move it 2 months. Let's move it 3 months later. Safety, 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 right? All of a sudden they want safety. Well, before I did the endorsement, they didn't talk about safety.
Okay, this is not true. The governor of Wisconsin called for the election to be delayed last week and called for a special legislative session over the weekend to vote on the legislation delaying it. Again, President Trump's suggestion that the desire to delay it was based on his endorsement of a judge is not supported by any facts at all.
Well, that you have a Democrat in Wisconsin as governor. Ask him. That's his problem. Okay, he should be doing it. Again, some governors fail, and I won't let them fail because when they fail, I'll help. But that's run by Democrats right now. Okay, it's run by Democrats. You had a great Republican.
Is it possible to socially distance when you're voting? You're going to have crowds.
You have to speak to the governor. What you should do is call the governor of Wisconsin and ask him that question.
This is really a remarkable turnaround. President Trump accused the Democratic governor of wanting to delay the election for only politics, and is now also, after Republicans blocked him from delaying the election, he is blaming the Democratic governor for the fact that people in line voting are not at-home social distancing. It is sort of mind-boggling that the president can criticize him for both.
Of mail-in voting, mail-in ballots for voting.
I think mail-in
A few minutes
voting
ago,
is
but
horrible.
You voted by
It's
mail
corrupt.
in Florida's election last month, didn't you?
Sure, I could vote by mail for that.
How do you reconcile
Because I'm
that?
allowed to. Well, that's called out of state. You know why I voted? Because I happen to be in the White House and I won't be able to go to Florida to vote.
the
But let me
difference
just
between
say,
mailing within
well, there's a
state or
big
mailing
difference
outside
between
state?
somebody that's out of state and does a ballot and everything sealed, certified, and everything else. You see what you have to do with the certifications. And you get thousands and thousands of people sitting in somebody's living room signing ballots all over the place.
This is a preposterous claim. First of all, he's saying that his mail-in ballot to Florida was fundamentally different from how someone else would vote by mail. And that's not true. It would be the same method. Secondly, as we've said, there is no documented problem of mail-in ballot fraud. This is just not a problem that has been documented.
Look at the statistics. There's a lot of dishonesty going along with mail-in voting, mail-in ballots.
You've encouraged state officials to buy their own medical equipment. The federal officials are kind of swooping in and scooping up those orders. How are you ensuring that it's being distributed fairly?
Well, we're getting great prices on equipment. We're getting great prices on equipment, and we're helping the states. And the governors are very thankful. Mike Pence had a call yesterday with every governor was on the call, and it was like a love fest. They're very happy. I don't know if they tell that to the press. Some of them don't. Some of them will never say good to the press, but they know we've done a great job. Not a good job, a great job.
I think the state officials are widely saying
No, I
that.
think sometimes it does. And what we say is, let us know, and we will immediately drop out of the bidding.
All right, so the president's saying a number of things here that are contradictory or not true. He's saying that it's not the case that he's made states get their own gear. The fact of the matter is, in a call with governors on March 16th, he told them that they were on their own to get it. Multiple governors have complained that by bidding with either each other or the federal government, that they are being priced out of getting the gear that they need. He's also saying that his supplying of gear is successful. We know that nearly 6,000 medical masks that had been sent to Alabama had dry rot and a 2010 expiration date. More than 150 ventilators sent to Los Angeles were broken and had to be repaired. The New York Times reported that thousands of ventilators that have been distributed have been, in fact, broken. And in Oregon, it was masks with faulty elastic that could cause the straps to break, causing medical workers to become exposed to the disease at the very moment that they are treating a patient.
Did you have one? Yes, please.
Mr. President, you have been very consistently supportive of a payroll relief tax.
Of what, payroll?
Payroll relief. Now, I know you're still busy trying to implement phase 3, but as we move towards phase 4, are there still obstacles to that? Because that would put money in American pockets consistently.
Yeah, you're right. I would love to see a payroll, good questions. I would love to see a payroll tax cut. And I think on behalf of the people, it would be quick. Now, it's a longer term, it's a longer time because it's over a period of a year or whatever you want to make it. But I would love to see a payroll tax cut. There are many people that would like to see it as a permanent tax cut, payroll tax cut.
Stopping it from
Well, the Democrats right now are stopping it.
What are their reasons?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe they think it's good politics to stop it. But you'd get a lot of people, a lot of money immediately. The payroll tax cut would be a great thing for this country. I would like to have it regardless of this.
So the president is talking about cutting payroll taxes. This includes cutting taxes for Social Security and Medicare. He has repeatedly, during his campaign, promised he would not cut these things. And since becoming president, he has advocated cutting them. And he is suggesting now cutting the taxes that pay for those programs themselves.
Ended period, and it would be simple to do. It's so easy to do. It's a great tax cut, and I'd love you to speak to the Democrats and let's get it done. So I'm going to give this now to Vice President Pence, and they're going to go over some very good statistics with everybody, and we'll have a couple of answers on that because we're working very hard on the African American community with respect to what's going on because it's not good. I don't like it. And we're going to have some very good statistics, Tony, I think, over the next couple of days. So thank you all very much. Thank you.
Okay, so the president is leaving, and Vice President Pence is taking the stand. I always like to take this time to remind you that as governor, Mike Pence's healthcare public policies contributed to the largest HIV outbreak ever in the history of the state of Indiana.
Is telling us, but suffice it to say, as the president said several times, this is a very tough week in America. And our hearts go out to all of the families that have lost loved ones to the coronavirus. But I know I speak for the entire White House coronavirus task force when I say our hearts are with the people of the greater New York City area today. As we stand here today, in the midst of heartbreaking numbers of losses in New York City, I also want to assure the American people that there's reason for hope. As Dr. Birx will enumerate in just a few moments, despite the increase in losses, as Governor Cuomo articulated today, hospital admissions continue to decline. And in our report early this morning from Dr. Birx, we continue to see evidence of stabilization in some of the areas around the country of the most significant outbreak. The New York metro area, including New Jersey, Long Island, and Connecticut. New Orleans metro area, Detroit, Boston, Chicago, and Denver, as Dr. Birx will explain, continue to give evidence of stabilization, which in a very real sense is evidence that the American people are putting into practice the social distancing, the President's guidelines for our nation. And for that, as the President said earlier today, we thank the American people. Even in the midst of hardship and loss, at a time when we've seen more than 385,000 Americans test positive for the coronavirus and more than 12,000 succumb to this illness, the evidence that Dr. Birx will describe to you will show that the American people know our future is in our hands. And so as I begin, allow me just simply to continue to urge every American to put into practice the guidance you're receiving from your state and local authorities.
Now, the Vice President is highlighting the importance of implementing social distancing. This administration has refused to call for a nationwide stay-in-place order, and there are still 8 or 9 states, all with Republican governors, who have refused to do that. And the President has been reluctant to himself demonstrate the behaviors that he is calling on people to undertake. He's calling on Americans to wear masks when they go out in public, but says that he will not wear one himself. He is calling upon people to stand 10 feet away from other people, but stands sometimes inches away from other members of his task force during these briefings. And he has been repeatedly holding meetings with leaders, stakeholders. Just last week had a meeting with 7 business leaders in person in the White House, amounting to groups of much more than 10 people gathered in one place at a time.
All of them. But right below our healthcare workers are all the people that are working in critical infrastructure around the country, and some of the most important people are working in food supply. I mean, from the farmers and the ranchers to our processors, to our distributors, to our truckers, to our grocers. Americans are keeping food on the table for our fellow Americans.
This is true and important. Food workers are keeping Americans from going hungry during this crisis. It is important to note that last week the President took the opportunity of this briefing to offer a couple of jabs at undocumented workers. Undocumented workers account for at least 1 million of U.S. farm workers and between 60 and 75% of California's farm workers. They work together in close conditions and with few precautions taken for their health. It is the risk that these undocumented workers are taking that is directly responsible for the food that is on our tables, and we need to be mindful of that.
It possible for Americans to have one less worry, and they are truly inspiring heroes. Now, that being said, I did hear from the industry today that there have been reports of some plants having reduced capacity because of people having concerns about exposure to the coronavirus. In fact, over the last several days, there's been some incidents of worker absenteeism, and some plants have actually been forced to close temporarily. And so on behalf of the President, on behalf of our entire team, and on behalf of a grateful nation, let me just say to all of you that are working in the food industry at every level across the country, just understand that you are vital. You are giving a great service to the people of the United States of America.
It is also important to remember when we're highlighting food workers that President Trump opposes raising the minimum wage. He has actually suggested eliminating it altogether. During his campaign, he complained that the current minimum wage was too high. So while Democrats are fighting for a $15 an hour minimum wage, which is still probably too little to live on in most cities, the President of the United States is seeking to lower it to whatever the market will bear.
Healthcare workers have the support that they need. With some 51 major disaster declarations, most recently Minnesota being approved, states have stood up 27,000 National Guard, but personnel-wise, before the end of business today, there will be more than 3,000 Department of Defense and Health and Human Service medical personnel on the ground in the greater New York City area. And those people will be redeployed once that region of the country moves through the coronavirus epidemic in that area. And we salute those extraordinary patriotic Americans for stepping forward to bring real relief to our healthcare workers. With regard to equipment, Admiral Polovchek reported to the task force throughout the course of the day today that we have continued to distribute ventilators across the country. We're sending additional ventilators from the Strategic National Stockpile. Maryland will receive 50 ventilators. Delaware will receive 50 ventilators. And that will leave more than 8,400 ventilators still in the national stockpile.
But it is important to remember that states are not getting the number of ventilators that they are asking for, and thousands of ventilators that have been delivered broken.
California generously made available, and the ventilators, some 500 ventilators that we again want to thank Governor Gavin Newsom and the people of California for donating to our nation's efforts. 100 of those are being deployed to New York, 100 to New Jersey, 100 to Illinois, 50 to Maryland, 50 to Washington, D.C., 50 to Delaware, and 50 to Nevada. With regard to the remainder of what we call personal protective equipment, again, we've been literally leaving no stone unturned anywhere in the country, anywhere around the world. And as
well, this is simply not true that they are leaving no stone unturned. The president has been remarkably reluctant to invoke the Defense Production Act, which would enable him to direct companies in any industry to produce equipment that was needed. I live down the street from a bar that has a naval compass from World War II that was made by the Lionel Toy Train Company. And the reason a toy train company made a naval compass in World War II was because there was a nationwide war effort, and all companies had to be making war equipment. And so you couldn't be making toys. Toy companies could be making materials that would be useful in this crisis. Any company that produces clothing could be producing protective masks and gowns. President Trump has stopped short of calling for that, even though he repeatedly compares this to a war effort.
More than 6 million surgical masks. When Governor Cuomo and I last spoke, he told me there was a real challenge for medical gowns in the New York City area and in New Jersey.
This is true. We have reported on a hospital in New York where nurses were reduced to wearing garbage bags as protective gear because of the shortage of gowns.
Challenges remain in that community. Some 837,000 N95 masks for healthcare workers, 165 surgical masks. Other items, including almost 6 million gloves, have been distributed. Detroit continues to be a real focal point. We're working closely with Governor Gretchen Whitmer as well as Mayor Mike Duggan to meet the needs of healthcare workers in Detroit.
Now, President Trump had urged Mike Pence publicly not to deal with Governor Gretchen Whitmer, calling her that woman in Michigan. He has repeatedly attacked Democratic governors in some of the states that have been hardest hit. Responsible practice break contrary to the guidance of public health officials.
These details in the hopes that healthcare workers looking on will be encouraged. Direction we are, you have safe for family, even while you provide that extraordinary and courageous care that our healthcare workers are providing literally around the clock in the midst of the coronavirus challenge. The last slide is just the cumulative numbers that we have distributed, and I'm happy in a few moments to answer any questions about that. Again, the system that we have in place is one that is essentially using our major distribution networks its way through these communities and through communities that are very much on our and let me just lastly say that I thank the American people for stepping up. Overwhelmed with one story after another, where people are doing social distancing, where people are looking after one another, where they're checking in with a phone call to an elderly friend, a family member, to make sure they're okay. I mean, we are on the front end of 30 days to slow the spread. And I will tell you, as a non-scientist up here, that I see glimmers of hope.
It is reassuring to hear Mike Pence acknowledge that he is not a scientist. President Trump has been offering guidance on what medicines people should take in contradiction to the actual doctors in his administration. His trade advisor, Peter Navarro, has been
the impact on lives by ensuring that we do our part to make sure that no one that is vulnerable is unnecessarily exposed to this virus. With that, let me yield to Dr. Birx and then Seema Verma and Dr. Fauci, and we'll take all your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. So hopefully you can see from those numbers that we've taken a data-detailed approach, really bringing the power of granular data to the supply chain and moving supplies based on really what you would call burden of disease and need. If I could just start out by not just going to the numbers at the beginning, but really talking to the community of health advocates, to the community that works on the social determinants of disease and the communities of the historic Black colleges and universities. We really need to improve messaging, and I'm asking them to help us increase the messaging around this. We don't want to give the impression that the African American community is more susceptible to the virus. We don't have any data that suggests that. What our data suggests is they're more susceptible to more difficult and severe disease and poorer outcomes. And we really need to make sure that every household is aware of what it's going to take to protect the individuals in that household that have pre-existing conditions. We could call on the indigenous nations, the real tribal leaders, to also be working very closely to protect the elders of their communities. We know this is more difficult in multi-generational households, and it's really going to call for really unbelievable attention to details of hand washing and protecting others from each other, particularly if you don't feel well. This is really a call to action to the communities to make sure that we get messages appropriately out there so that everyone understands what it's going to take for us all to protect one another. And we know it can be done because we can see these changes. I wanted to go through the numbers at a high level so you understand why particularly these supplies went to these areas to begin with. We talk about attack rates or the cases per population. So in the New York, as a state, they have 7 cases per 1,000. This is the highest in the country. In New York City itself, it's closer to almost twice that in New York City. New Jersey is 4 per 1,000, Louisiana 3 per 1,000, Massachusetts 2 per 1,000, Connecticut 2 per 1,000, Michigan 1.5 per 1,000. The District of Columbia and the Baltimore area now 1.5 per 1,000, and we're watching them very closely. Pennsylvania 1 per 1,000, but we're concerned about Philadelphia. What is allowing us to move supplies based on burden of disease and need is the extraordinary West Coast that has had very low numbers, from Washington that was less than 1 per 1,000, California that is less than 0.5 per 1,000, and Oregon that's even less than that. And it's those states where there's large populations, because of the enormous work that they're doing to prevent expansion and spread of the virus. It's allowing resources to go to these states and these communities and these counties that need more support. And so this kind of data analysis is allowing us to make very intelligent decisions about need, but also really understanding what's happening across the country in the development of the curves, as you have heard about. And so we do see, and I know you heard me caution that over the weekend sometimes there's decreased case reporting, and so there were increases in a series of communities on Monday. We're seeing that stabilize again, and when you look over 3 days, you're starting to see that we may be actually in a series of communities outside of New York and New Jersey and Connecticut creating a much flatter graph. A much flatter curve. So you saw New York and the increase, and then you saw, we're hoping, as Governor Cuomo and the mayor has described, that they're getting to a steady state where the next outcome is going down. But we see across the country, in Detroit, in Chicago, some real, not this extreme going to 7 cases per 1,000, but really staying in the more 2 cases per 1,000 and a different curve parameter then, and it really shows the amazing activity of every American in those cities to really ensure that there's social distancing, and really importantly to ensure there's less socialization between households, and really ensuring that the household really remains independent and protected, and not really at this moment going out into the community or socializing anywhere but a virtual way on computers, by Zoom, by FaceTime. And I think we can really see that in the data, and it's really given us great heart. I want to finish by really talking to my laboratory directors, because you're extraordinary and you've done an amazing amount of testing. Those nearly 2 million tests that we're getting to, those were all done in the last 2 to 3 weeks. But we do have excess capacity. So if all the lab directors could look in their laboratories, if they have an Abbott M2000, if they could get that up and running, we could double the number of tests that we're doing per day. That is a high throughput. The machines are throughout the United States. There's hundreds of them. Right now, about 80% of them are idle. We're going to have a call with the laboratory directors of these laboratories to really ensure this is an automated, robotic situation.
See, and what's striking here is what Dr. Birx is highlighting is that we are still now in April struggling to figure out how to perform widespread testing when South Korea, who had their first case on the same day as the U.S., was doing widespread testing within 2 weeks of that diagnosis in January.
Community testing and surveillance. And then finally, you will see, and you've heard about it happening in the UK and other places, there's a series of antibody tests out there that have not been validated. We're working right now very closely with a series of companies that know how to make these tests, that have made these tests for us for decades, for HIV, for a rapid test. They're working on that technology to bring that quality of test, which is in the 90+% sensitivity and specificity, to the American people for antibody tests. But until we get those, if you see them on the internet, do not buy them until we can give you a test that's reliable for all Americans, and we are working very hard to have that happen and bring that to the American public. Some of the tests that may be available on the internet may have very low sensitivity and specificity and give you a false reassurance that you either give you a false positive or a false negative, implying that you may be protected. So please wait until we have those tests available and validated. People are working around the clock to make those available to the American people. We all understand how important that is because you've heard us talk about asymptomatic cases, and we really want to know how broad that is and how common that is. And so in places like New York City, where I described that they had the 7 per 1,000, sometimes 2, 3, and 4 times any other place in the United States, to know what the number of people who never had symptoms but do have a positive test would be really critical at this point, particularly as we plan for any reoccurrence in the fall or in future seasons. Thank you.
Great. And we at Seema Verma, Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, will discuss what we've done to support hospitals. As we support healthcare workers, we want to make sure the institutions that are providing the environment for care are well financed, and she's got a couple of funding streams, and help is on the way. Seema?
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. And let me just start with echoing the President and the Vice President's comments about our condolences to all the people out there that have lost somebody to the coronavirus. And also, sincere appreciation and thanks to all our healthcare workers that are on the front lines. But we know that it's the impact on the healthcare system isn't just those frontline workers. Healthcare organizations across the nation are having increased expenses. They're having to spend more on supplies. You're seeing all of the supplies that are being sent to them, and that's having a direct impact on their bottom line. Many of them are also having increased expenses because they're taking advantage of some of the flexibilities that we've given them. Hospitals without walls, they're putting, you may see tents out in their parking lots where they're doing testing or screening, so they have a lot of increased expenses as well. Other healthcare organizations are not performing essential surgeries or other services. A lot of them are moving to telehealth, and that represents lost revenue for these healthcare organizations across the country. And so the President has asked us to address this issue. About 10 days ago, we put out something called accelerated payments that we do in the Medicare program, and it allows us to advance payments to providers based on their historical Medicare revenues that they receive. So just in 10 days, we've been able to provide payments to providers. We had about 25,000 requests. We've processed about 70% of these. It's happened in about 5 days, and the total on that is about $34 billion that we've managed to put into the healthcare system. But those are essentially loans. The President has asked us to go further with this and to start the implementation of the CARES Act. That provides $100 billion to the healthcare system. You've heard Secretary Azar talk about the focus on some of those dollars going towards the uninsured, but the President wants us to accelerate getting those dollars out. And so this week we will be putting out another $30 billion, which are grants. This is going to be based on Medicare revenue. There are no strings attached, so the healthcare providers that are receiving these dollars can essentially spend that in any way that they see fit. Also, this is going to be done in a very easy, simplified way for many of our healthcare providers. We actually do direct deposit with them, and so those dollars will just go right into their bank accounts. For other providers, all it's going to require is some very simple registration, and we'll be able to give them that money as well. So we're expecting that to happen this week. The other thing to note is that this is not a first-come, first-served basis. Because we are basing this on their Medicare revenue, they will get these dollars. So even if it takes a few days, there shouldn't be any panic in the system as well. The other thing to recognize here is that our priority was on getting these dollars out as quickly as possible. We heard that from the many healthcare providers across the country that weighed in on this. They said the most important thing was to get these dollars out as quickly as possible. But we recognize that in terms of getting these dollars out, because it's based on Medicare revenues, there are providers out there, pediatricians, children's hospitals, OBGYNs, even our nursing homes, that a lot of their revenue comes from other sources, Medicaid or other payer sources. And so those organizations will be addressed in the second tranche of funding, and we'll have a priority for these organizations and these types of healthcare providers. Also just want to say, so together between the loans that we've put out there with our accelerated payments and the $30 billion, that's about $64 billion for the healthcare system this week alone. And so I think, again, this is part of our effort to support the healthcare system, and also just want to, again, say thank you to all our healthcare providers out on the front lines. To all Americans, the best thing that we can do to support our healthcare providers is to adhere to those guidelines around 30 days to slow the spread. That is the best thing that we can do to support our healthcare workers. Thank you.
Dr. Fauci, please.
I just want to make a brief comment to get back to the discussion about the health disparities in the African American community, because it really is very important. And the reason I want to bring it up, because I couldn't help sitting there reflecting about sometimes when you're in the middle of a crisis like we are now with the coronavirus, it really does have ultimately shine a very bright light on some of the real weaknesses and foibles in our society. And as some of you know, the greater proportion of my professional career has been defined by HIV/AIDS. And if you go back then, during that period of time when there was extraordinary stigma, particularly against the gay community, and it was only when the world realized how the gay community responded to this outbreak with incredible courage and dignity and strength and activism that I think that really changed some of the stigma against the gay community, very much so. I see a similarity here because health disparities have always existed for the African American community. But here again with the crisis, how it's shining a bright light on how unacceptable that is, because yet again, when you have a situation like the coronavirus, they are suffering disproportionately. As Dr. Berg said correctly, it's not that they're getting infected more often, it's that when they do get infected, their underlying medical conditions, the diabetes, the hypertension, the obesity, the asthma, those are the kind of things that wind them up in the ICU and ultimately give them a higher death rate. So when all this is over, and as we've said, it will end. We will get over coronavirus, but there will still be health disparities, which we really do need to address in the African American community. Thanks.
That was mostly very seriously accurate. One thing, he did say that they don't believe that there is a higher infection rate among Black Americans, and there is beginning to be evidence to suggest that, and the numbers I cited from Chicago highlighted that while only 30% of Chicago's population is Black, Black Chicagoans account for more than half of all the coronavirus cases there.
To see the progress that we've made. We continue to witness that the numbers where the outbreak began, we all remember when this first emerged in the Seattle area, the numbers continue to be steady and low. And what we've seen...
The Vice President is saying that the numbers in the U.S. Continue to be steady and low. This is not a true statement. The U.S. has the most cases of any nation in the world. It accounts for roughly 26% of all the world's cases. And so that was sort of a baffling statement.
We tend to think of this as one large curve in our minds when it began in our country, and we long for the day that it will end, and we want to hasten that day by putting into practice all these mitigation efforts. The reality is, what these experts have explained to this layperson is that what we're actually going to witness is a number of small curves that will cumulatively mean that curve. And for Oregon, for Washington State, for California to recognize where the need is, and then to partner with us and FEMA to make sure the resources are there at the time of the need, at the point of the need, I think is really inspiring. But Dr. Birx, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I want to be clear. No, we didn't ask for their ventilators. They looked at their epidemiologic curves. These states have amazing health commissioners, and I think when this is over, we'll really be. All of the models were based on something we have never attempted to do anywhere in the world. We have never attempted to do this kind of mitigation. It was always theoretic to many individuals, and now we see across the globe people mitigating against this virus, realizing that their own behaviors can change the course and future of this virus in their communities, which is really astounding, the power that gives us to actually understand that we can compete against this virus and do well. And so I think their governors and their health commissioners looked at their curves, looked at their hospitals, looked at their ICU, and looked at their needs, and then decided that they didn't need those at this time and wanted to make it available for other states that were in more of that 2 per 1,000, 3 per 1,000, 4 per 1,000, and 7 per 1,000. And I think we'll learn a lot from other states and other communities to really understand how to do this better next time. And I think this is what will teach us, because we've never attempted anything like this, at least in my lifetime, where we've had, these 30 days to stop the spread. I mean, we've not ever put out information like that.
What is both inspiring but also tragically discouraging in what Dr. Birx is describing is that we hope to learn from this situation, and we hope to leave these guidelines in place for a future generation to benefit from should they need it. But we know that when a previous administration devised a playbook to prepare for this very scenario and to warn against that and to try to make sure that we wouldn't have to learn by doing, that playbook was disregarded. And I pray that whatever administration or generation next has to face something like this, that they actually will choose to learn from the information that has been left behind.
Getting into that 24-hour window you've talked about being very important. And then what is the status of the self-swab test?
So we're tracking all of that very closely. I use my time here to appeal to people specifically, the health educators, the health advocates, because I know the power with them. But to my lab directors, I really need the Abbott M2000 online, because that means we can do an extra 100,000 tests a day, and there's enormous power in that. The ability to self-test, last time I had my test here, I self-tested, so it can be done. It's straightforward. It works very well with that rapid 5-minute test. But what we now have to create, and I know that's always difficult because everybody wants one of something, we now have to create a mosaic that brings together where we know every single machine is in the United States, where our gaps are, and then align resources with need and gaps in the testing and ensure that we have the right laboratory test for the right community. So you can see there would be communities, particularly the Indian Health Service or rural communities, where that Abbott ID Now kit could be incredibly helpful, because otherwise they're shipping it all the way to a capital, maybe 3 states away, and that's going to add 2 or 3 days to the wait time, which we're trying to get away from.
Right. The backlog, 2 or 3 days, or what would you?
It varies state by state, and we'll be talking with all of the states about really changing how we do testing in the community to really ensure that we're testing optimally. Because right now we have still focused very much on hospital diagnosis because we know it will make a difference in treatment. So these major laboratories are still putting drive-through tests at the back to all the hospital tests. And so that's where the backlog is in the drive-through tests. So I know if you're an outpatient, not an inpatient, but if you're an outpatient, that is where the delays right now are, but it's state by state. And so some states have 24-hour, 48 hours for both their outpatients and inpatients. Others have short for inpatient and longer in outpatient, and then we're trying to reconcile those two pieces.
Right.
And I do want to note that last week on a conference call, governors of both parties complained that they could not increase the number of tests performed because of a shortage of supplies needed to conduct the tests. And this included Maryland's Republican Governor Larry Hogan, who said that he was, quote, flying blind because of a lack of testing.
Strong and swift efforts of the FDA has created a test to put in that for the coronavirus, and it's a 15-minute test. And so I want to renew our call to all the healthcare providers around the country is find your Abbott device, and we'll work our hearts out to get a test to you. How about in the back corner?
Mr. Vice President, thank you. One for you and then one for either of the doctors, if you don't mind. For you, sir, back to this idea of reopening up the economy, since it's not like there's a switch that you can just turn it back on. How does the administration envision this happening? Is it guidance from the White House and you hope the governors follow it? Are you going to put it in the governor's hands or the mayor's hands? How do you envision all of that working together?
Well, the one thing I can assure you is that the president's decision in that regard is going to be informed by what the data shows and about decisions about when we can responsibly reopen America and put America back to work. I can tell you the CDC will have new guidance tomorrow that the CDC will be publishing for people who were in proximity to an individual that tested positive for coronavirus but have no symptoms. And CDC will be publishing new guidance about how those individuals and the circumstances under which they might be able to return back to work using some facial protection and monitoring their temperature, but we'll detail that for you. But what we're going to be doing over the weeks ahead is, while we focus every day at the point of the need, as the president said many times, our first mission is to save lives. And that means to slow the spread, bend the curve, to continue to engage the American people, which they are admirably doing, to continue to put all the social distancing into practice. But there is a dual track that the president has already initiated. Some of the best minds here at the White House are beginning to think about what recommendations will look like that we give to businesses, that we give to states. But it'll all, I promise you, be informed on putting the health and well-being of the American people first.
We hope that the president has said many things that would lead us to think otherwise. He has at times suggested that the saving of lives is too great a cost for the harm to the economy, using repeatedly the phrase, we can't let the cure be worse than the problem. We are coming up on Easter this Sunday, by which time he had suggested, without scientific basis for it, that the country should be reopened. And fortunately, he has backed away from that. But there is obviously reason to have skepticism over when and how he might encourage Americans to return to normal.
Who find themselves having to distance teach kids. And I'm proud of Karen, but relatedly, I'm proud of every teacher in this country. Secretary of Education was here not long ago talking about our efforts to expand distance learning resources, even in K through 12. To all the teachers who are out there, we just want to say thank you. Thank you for what you're doing, for continuing learning even in this challenging time. And to all of the kids, just because you're home doesn't mean you don't have to do your schoolwork. Keep it up.
Anticipate children being back in class?
What I will tell you is I'll yield to the health experts, but that'll be part of what we're looking at in terms of guidance going forward, whether it...
Now, the Vice President is praising teachers, as well he should. I do want to note that the Trump administration has sought to slash over $8.5 billion from the Department of Education.
She asked me the same question. You know, it is unpredictable, but you can get a feel for if we start talking about the things where the curve goes down and we really have minimal, how we respond and what kind of a rebound we see or don't see, I think is going to have a lot of influence, probably more immediately on things like summer camps than it does in the fall. I fully expect, though I'm humble enough to know that I can't accurately predict, that by the time we get to the fall, that we will have this under control enough that it certainly will not be the way it is now, where people are shutting schools. My optimistic side tells me that we'll be able to renew to a certain extent, but it's going to be different. Remember now, because this is not going to disappear. So we're going to have in place the capability of doing the things that we talk about all the time on this stage. to identify, to isolate, to contact trace, number one. Number two, by that time, we'll have a better feel with the antibody test about what the actual penetrance of this infection was in society. How many people have actually been infected? Who's protected? If you have antibody, it's very likely that you're protected. Who's vulnerable? Do you treat vulnerables different than you treat the people who are protected? All of these things are going to go into the decision of just how much back to the original way we'd like it to be in the fall. Bottom line is no absolute prediction, but I think we're going to be in good shape.
Okay, this is very important to note. Dr. Fauci is saying we can't guarantee that in the fall things will be back to normal, and we have to be, while he does not believe we will be sheltering in place, we have to be prepared for the possibility. This is important to keep in mind with regards to the November election. This is why voting rights advocates are urging that we need to be prepared for the possibility of a vote-by-mail system. President Trump has said again today that he is adamantly opposed to that. But if we wait until we're close to November to start making those plans, it will be impossible to put them in place for a nationwide voting by mail.
Say the virus caused you to go to the ICU and then have a heart or kidney problem. Some countries are recording that as a heart issue or a kidney issue and not a COVID-19 death. Right now, we're still recording it, and the great thing about having forms that come in and a form that has the ability to mark it as COVID-19 infection, the intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
Can you be sure, you hear from coroners that that's not necessarily the case. Are you sure, how can you be confident about that, and is there any concern that it skews the data that you're trying to collect in terms of projections and things like that?
Well, I think that would apply more to rural areas that may not have the same level of testing, but I am pretty confident in New York City and in New Jersey and places that have these large outbreaks and COVID-only hospitals. I can tell you they are testing. New York and New Jersey together have, by proportion, are testing extraordinarily well as Washington State and Louisiana. So I don't see that there's been a barrier in testing to diagnosis.
Okay, well, what Dr. Birx has said just there is actually not totally accurate. The question was whether undiagnosed cases of coronavirus that contribute to death or deaths that are not attributed to coronavirus would be counted in the death toll. And Dr. Birx said that they would be, especially in some place like New York. WNYC reported today that New York's at-home deaths are currently about 10 times their usual rate. So it is extremely likely that a lot of these deaths are related to the coronavirus, even though they are not being identified as such.
Do you expect that pattern to continue nationwide? Some states have not even reported their data yet.
I can't be confident to predict patterns, but the underlying reason why that is happening doesn't change from state to state.
Do you expect it to get worse?
Now, I expect that when African Americans get infected, given the disproportionate disparity of the underlying conditions that lead to complications like the ones I mentioned, I expect that we will still see the pattern that when you look at the proportion of people who get into serious trouble and die, again, it's going to be disproportionate towards the African Americans. I do expect that.
And is the federal government now leading the charge in collecting this information from the states, and when will it be made public?
Yes, the answer is yes. It will be public as soon as you get enough data to be able to make a meaningful statement.
So can we expect this week or a couple of days?
The task force has assigned that to several members of the team. We're assembling that data now. It is a great concern for us, and but it's probably a good reminder that we have to be especially careful around people with serious underlying health conditions. As we've said it many times from this podium over many weeks, that The risk of serious illness from the coronavirus remains low for the average American. But for anyone from any community that has a serious underlying health condition, particularly senior citizens with serious underlying health conditions, the risk of tragedy is very real. And so we're going to be very diligent about studying this and providing information and guidance in accordance with our best scientists. But I do want to say to each and every American, the President's coronavirus guidelines for America about wash your hands. If you're sick, stay home. If you can work from home, if you're not in critical infrastructure like our incredible healthcare workers or all those heroic people working to keep food on the shelves at our grocery stores and keeping medicine at the pharmacies, we ask you to work from home if you can. Avoid unnecessary travel. Avoid gatherings of more than 10 people. Use a drive-through at a restaurant. Don't go in the restaurant. Not just to protect your health, but to protect those of every community, of every background in this country who may have underlying conditions that make them susceptible to tragic outcomes. That's how we can all do our part to slow the spread and to protect our most vulnerable. And the American people are doing it, and as we continue to do that, we will hasten the day that we put the coronavirus in the past and we reopen America and put America back to work. Thank you all. We'll see you tomorrow.
And that is the end of today's coronavirus task force briefing. And during the time that this briefing took place, since we went on the air, there have been over 2,000 new cases of the disease and about 150 deaths. I had the support today of Maddie Green, Zara Heder, Megan Hirschlein, Ian McKenna, Nico Pitney, and Shelby Backelin. I'm Alan Piper. I'm the senior politics producer for NowThis. I am grateful for you for joining us. This week is for two of the most widely practiced faiths in the country, is a Holy Week. You would expect families and friends to be gathering tomorrow night for the Passover Seder. This coming weekend is Easter. These are both celebrations of life amid death and hope conquering fear. And at this particular time, while this is an unusual way to acknowledge those holidays, those principles are perhaps more keenly felt than ever. We will be back tomorrow. Please join us, and please have a safe night. Please stay in, take care of yourself, take care of your loved ones, and let your loved ones know how much you care about them. I'm Alan Piper. Have a good night.